right, good evening and welcome to Voice of the People 90.3 FM. Today is quite a very special day where we'll be taking a look into women representation in the media space. And it's quite an interesting one because these conversations are needed all the time. Of course, Voice of the People 90.3 FM basically would actually promote that idea and that agenda. And that's why we're having this very special interview with a very special person, definitely to partnership. And of course, we will definitely, while I introduce her, we'll get to know some very deep insights as to why this concept, all right, is on the move, what originated it, and definitely how the gap will be bridged. Because at this point in time, it's important for us to fill in that porosity so that we can have a smooth process and gender proper representation, equality in the media space. Now, what are we looking at today? We're looking at women in media, all right, and we're bridging the gap in representation, which is what a lot of people, especially in Africa, West Africa, may actually have one or two doubts about or one or two complaints about. Now, women have historically been underrepresented and misrepresented in the media, all right, which has reinforced harmful stereotypes and contributing to gender inequality. The media actually, as we know, plays a significant role in shaping societal perceptions and attitudes towards women. Okay, the idea is to bridge the gap in representation, and it requires quite a lot for that gap to be addressed. Now, we're going to be looking at key issues. However, I am not doing this alone. My special guest to actually have this conversation with this evening is Dr. Yemisi Akinbobola. She is a renowned British Nigerian media expert, a researcher, and entrepreneur, co-founder and CEO of African Women in Media. She promotes African women's voices and perspectives in global media. Now, Yemisi holds a PhD in media and communication from the University of Westminster. She has worked as a senior producer for the BBC World Service and has taught at the University of Westminster. All right. Now, as we do know, African Women in Media was founded in 2017 and is a revolutionary platform which empowers African women to take center stage in media. One of the objectives is to bridge the gap in representation by providing training, networking opportunities, and amplifying African women's stories. The impact is basically to empower hundreds of women, foster diverse perspectives, and challenging stereotypes. All right, now let's welcome Dr. Yemisi Akinbobola. Good evening, Mama, and thank you for joining us on Voice of the People 90.3 FM.
Good evening, and thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to be with you as well. I sincerely do appreciate you having to come up with this conversation because it is something that is quite dire to orientate ourselves in. And one of the situations that women in media have found themselves is either they're underrepresented or they're put at the background, or either the wages, when it comes to wages, it's not equal. They're actually the brainwork to a lot of content that we see on the media, but when it comes to their voices being heard, sometimes it's silenced. In this part of the world, we will say, okay, we're trying in terms of, women having to occupy managerial positions in the media space, but there is a huge gap, all right, still there. Why do you think that is?
Well, thank you. That's a really important question. And just before I answer your question, I just want to correct a little part of your introduction of me. I'm actually a senior lecturer at Birmingham City University, as well as being CEO and co-founder of African Women in Media.
Amazing.
Yes, and so that's my background. But to answer your question, we've done a lot of research, and lots of research has been done, both in terms of the representation of women as subjects of media content. So that is, how does media report women's issues or women generally, or the extent to which women are visible as expert sources in media. And the second aspect, in terms of the lived experiences of women in media in across Africa. We've done a lot of research around that. And I think there's the extent to which, one, there is a recognition that there is an issue and that issue is very important. Is the starting point. The second point is understanding what are the issues. So some of the things you've already said around the gender pay gap, for example, around the limitations or the barriers to progression into certain roles, particularly leadership roles, and part of that is things relating to sexual harassment, sextortion as a very specific one. So sextortion is um, where where people in a senior position, for example, um, request for sexual favors in exchange for a promotion, for a job, those kind of things, and that happens at different levels. So whether you're an intern or you're trying to get into the profession or those kind of things, and so there's various layers of barriers that women in media generally having to build resilience against, and also has historically led to a lot of labeling also of women in media in kind of those negative terms. So there's multiple kind of layers of issues that we could potentially talk about, and part of our work is to, number one, do the research that we're aware of what the issues are. Number two is to work directly with women in media to empower them to, build capacity, those kind of things. And then number three also is to work with policymakers, media organizations, to improve their practices. And because once you become aware of the issue, then then the next step should be changing the environment.
Dr. Yemi, so you really highlighted something very important. I will tell you that I've been a victim of that aspect of harassment, a situation where I'm victimized, intimidated, my voice is not heard, I'm not represented, no opportunity for me to grow just because I did not fall into the whims and caprices of the opposite gender, and I had to prove myself. I had to strive and work so hard intellectually so that I'm not seen in that form. And I must tell you that quite a lot of women, especially in West Africa, are going through this, considering the fact that we represent more than half of the population in African countries, but there is a serious major underrepresentation. So there are some factors that some persons will say is the reason, which could be either our religion or our culture. Do you think that in Nigeria, for example, let's use that as a platform, that we are beginning to break through that stereotype?
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that we have really good examples that we can point to of women in media leadership, of organizations where there are good representation of women. So, for example, women in media leadership, people like Muabudu, for example, right? Because when we're speaking about media, we speak about media in the broader terms. Media organizations like TVC, for example, that have a good range of women in different positions. So we have really good examples to point to. No, because again, some of the, when the environment is already very patriarchal and already very kind of established in a particular way, it takes time for that change to truly happen. We did some research, and the impact of it also can be felt in terms of the kind of content and how we're reporting on issues. So it's not just a issue of, there's not enough women in the organization, but if the organization itself is not gender aware broadly, especially on some of the societal issues, then the ways in which they represent those issues, again, further reinforces some of those cultural things that you mentioned. So, for example, we just concluded, we're in the last few weeks of concluding a 3-year project in Nigeria, where we looked at media's coverage of violence against women and girls in Nigeria, and the project also looked at the kind of violence women journalists in Nigeria face. And so what we found was that actually, number one, in terms of coverage of violence against women and girls, there are certain kind of stories that are prioritized in those coverage. The language used often results in victim blaming, sensationalized headlines, and rather insensitive in many areas. Again, there's really good examples of where they're working. So, and then again, where there are cultural perceptions of the role of women generally, it is the job of the media organizations to ensure that the environment limits the extent to which some of those cultural barriers can present itself in its organization. So, for example, by developing gender policies, right? Because gender policies should speak both to your content and the way you operate in your organization. I just came back from Ethiopia actually this morning, where I met with a group of women journalists from across Africa. And, we hear the same stories of, we're in a meeting, I'm a senior editor, we're in a meeting with my subordinates, I'm the only woman in the room, and they're asking me to make tea. you know, they're asking me to make tea. And so then in that situation, the woman is, because she's, you know, she's trying to maintain her authority.
Exactly.
She's put into a position where she has to enforce that authority and kind of push back. And then again, what then happens? You get labeled as bossy or labeled as not this or not that, because you're trying to stop those kind of things happening. So yeah, culture does play a huge fact, and that's not to say culture and gender equality can't coexist, because it can, right? It can coexist, but it starts from organizations and individuals recognizing that there's a problem first, and then taking those necessary steps to adjust to address them, and really not placing the onus on the women journalists themselves to address it themselves, right? Yeah.
All right. So, Dr. Yemisi, I'm sure you recall in 2023 there was a supposed uprising in Iran where two Iranian female journalists who helped break the story of Mahsa Amini's death in custody in September actually had to go on trial before a revolutionary court. Now, this is the thing that happened. The Iranian authorities, we do know, arrested at least 75 journalists, and most of them were women. One of the reasons was because Miss Hamidi, a 30-year-old journalist with the Shark newspaper, all right, was actually captioned. She wore a black dress of mourning, and she was, you know, trying to campaign for the fact that she was not going to wear the hijab. Now, we saw a situation where this particular reporter was killed in the process, and it sparked an uprising. Now, that is just one, possibly because this one was publicized. So you see in countries like this where it's either the religion or the cultural practices that kind of allows the patriarchal society limit the women. I know that you have, for example, as you have mentioned, gone through several processes to ensure that that representation is acquired, that orientation is there, and you're creating a platform through which that porosity will be filled. So, right now, what are these challenges that you have witnessed, and what have you been able to do about it? I mean, in your own little way.
No, thank you. Very important question. So I would say, I mean, whilst the organization has been existing since started as a Facebook group in 2016, for the first few years, what we did was firstly to create an avenue for conversation, right? So we did our annual conference starting from 2017. And so for the first 3 or so years, that was what we did. And that's important because we must not undervalue the opportunity for dialogue, right? Because that is the environment in which those issues are initially highlighted. Okay, so I would say that's the first intervention we made, was creating an environment where there was women prioritized in terms of the focus and the content, right? Where those conversations could be had. And it's really, I mean, I'll give you the example of the one we did in Nigeria in 2018, where we had an academic who came, a male academic who came and said, you know, he doesn't really understand all of this issue of gender equality and, you know, why it's really important in the media industry, etc. But that person actually wrote me a very long email after that conference saying, I'm really glad I came. Now I really get it. And as a result of that conference, he then went on to adjust his curriculum, the course that he teaches at university. And that is really important. The reason why I start from that point is that it starts from there. It starts from training. It starts from our education, our curriculum, and the extent to which we are now willing and able to adapt to today, to 2024, right? Many of our media curriculum need that update and need that gender lens interrogation, so that we are producing media producers, content makers who are gender aware, who understand what the issue is. So that's why I start from that point. The second thing we've gone on to do, again, more research to really know what the issues are, right? And I've mentioned some of those things around gender pay gap, sexual harassment, limited progression, etc. And we've done a lot of training as well, okay? And we utilize our online platform, our learning, for that, because that allows us to reach many more people than a physical training as well. So we've done a lot of training. We have a lot of kind of self-paced training available on our platforms. And again, what has that resulted in? It has resulted in skills development, because part of our objective, yes, is to change the environment so that it's more gender equal and equitable, but then also to empower the women to take up roles that perhaps they've been limited to taking up because of certain barriers to them, right?
Yes.
I remember there was a journalist who joined one of our first trainings, and she was based in Tanzania then. And she's been in media for a long time, had been progressing, and after doing our training and developing her profile, she's now working in New York, right, reporting on UN related issues and traveling the world, right? So those kind of things, making sure you're creating the environment, yes, but also the people behind within the environment to make sure that they can develop their skills and stuff. And then we've also done a lot of work around policy, so research informed policy. So I'll give you the example of Rwanda, where we did research, look at the barriers for women journalists in Rwanda, and found that sexual harassment was the top issue. And so I was in Rwanda for a week after the research was concluded, presenting to different stakeholders. And in one particular session with media managers, so that is all of the media leaders in the country, where I presented this data. Of course, the usual reaction is often, "Oh, but men are harassed too," and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it's kind of very zero-sum attitude to the situation. But then in the end, they came round, and there was a unanimous agreement to set up an anti-sexual harassment committee for the whole media in the whole of Rwanda, right? Which is huge. And as a result of that committee, they then set up an anti-sexual harassment policy for the whole country, for the media in the whole country. Right, so you can see real impact, and all of the media organizations in Rwanda have now signed that policy. They've signed that, and what is unique about the committee is that it is independent of any singular body, right, but representative of all of them. So that's another example of kind of interventions that we've made. And again, we've done country level, so like I said, work in Nigeria, that has trained, I think we trained well over 200 women. We also produce content on our news, so we give a platform where we give exampple and ways to and actually allow journalists to produce gender angle of issues that they're writing about.
That's very
fantastic. But I would say our main kind of flagship activities, our annual conference, and this year is the 8th annual conference, and it's going to be in Dakar in Senegal, with the theme around media and sustainability, right?
Yes.
And so that is really, again, the reason why I bring that up, apart from the fact that it's coming up soon, is that the sub themes, one of the sub themes is about business and media business and financial models, right?
Okay.
Why is that important? It's important because that's a real industry issue.
Exactly.
That we're dealing with, right? Every media organization is looking at their bottom line, is looking at how they adapt to new audience needs, etc.
Exactly. And make money out of it.
Exactly. But oftentimes, we do not consider the gender perspective in that process, right? We do not consider actually how is our content meeting the needs of 50% of our population. That is women, right?
Yes.
We do not think about the economic benefits, the business case for ensuring that you have a equal and equitable work environment that draws the talents that you need to advance your media business models, right? So, and then also at that within that sub theme, we want to present case studies of women-led and women-owned media that have, developed effective and innovative models as well. So that is what is quite unique about our conferences, that it's not necessarily a women-only space. That's not the case.
Because I was about to ask you that. I was about to ask you that as well. But continue.
Yeah, it's a women prioritizing environment. That is to say, we are taking everything from a gender angle, right? So yes, when you look at that theme, for example, you see that we're not just talking about gender equality in that sense, but we're talking about real business issues, media business issues. The second theme is around media. It's around development. So development issues generally, whether it's climate change, peace and security, all development issues. And again, speaking about how not necessarily the media's role in all of this, but that is how media kind of works alongside development agendas. And then finally, AI, artificial intelligence.
Exactly.
right? Because again, and other emerging technologies, because there's a real sense in which people have a lot of anxieties around AI, but then there's so many more opportunities around AI as well that when so the conversation around that is looking at both sides of it.
Okay.
How do we make sure that as we embrace AI in newsrooms, in media organizations, we don't reinforce some of the existing gender barriers?
Exactly.
That's number one. But then number two, how do we make AI work for us? How do we embrace AI in a way that is positive and use it effectively? And again, all of that joins up with the first two sub things around business models, etc. And there's great examples of newsrooms in Zimbabwe, in southern African countries, where they are using AI innovatively, but they're not, not many great examples of where AI is being used innovatively but gender sensitively.
Yeah, that's
so
true.
so some really important
And
conversations
aside
that
from that, too, right here in Nigeria or some part of West Africa, there is a lack in that, specifically women having to use AI in the newsroom. I must tell you, even to embrace new technology in the newsroom in Nigeria took a long time. And so I think this is another platform through which that orientation, that training, and, letting women get used to it in this part of the world specifically, because somehow I don't know, in this part of the world, when it comes to progressing in AI technology, it seems to be a hiccup. I don't know what the situation is. However, in that aspect, women are already embracing it a lot. There's a high representation of women in AI and, technology, media technology. However, finally, before I let you go, Ma'am, in terms of regulation, do you think the government needs to come in here? Not just regulation on paper, all right, actively make sure that it is something that is represented across board in the media space, the government having to work in terms of regulation.
That is such an important important question that you've asked, because there is a element in which we want the regulators and the policymakers to make sure that things like the NBC code, for example, provides for gender issues. So, for example, in the NBC code, there is no provision for coverage of gender-based violence. There is nothing that speaks to gender parity and equality and equity in terms of roles in the media. So once you have those provided for in such documents, then it mandates media organizations themselves to then create internal policies that address those things. So on the one side, yes, there is an absolute need for regulators and policymakers to get involved at that level. And I'll come back to kind of even an AU level regulation in a second. So there's that aspect. There's also other aspects in terms of, because a part of my PhD was me analyzing this NBC code. I mean, it's a long time ago, but, relatively minimum change since then. So there is extent to which there is a provision in it, but then there is the extent to which the enforcement of it does not reinforce existing kind of issues around press freedom, right?
Yes.
So it must be a collaboration. It must be a joined up effort. Beyond the regulators, you have the unions like the NUJ, for example, working in collaboration with the policy, with the regulators, with the right ministries as well, right? So there's that collaboration that needs to happen. Now, I said earlier on that I just came back from Ethiopia. That's because the African Union and the Federation of African Journalists brought together 15 representatives of women journalists across Africa, right? I was representing members of African women in media, and what we're trying to do was so the African Union are drafting the convention on the elimination of gender violence in Africa, right? So it's a continental mechanism. And so what they wanted us to make sure was that convention adequately provided for women journalists. Okay, so that's what we did. We spent 2 very intensive days making sure that happened. And so that convention doesn't just deal with women journalists, but it includes them in the conversation around ending violence against women and girls. And it will be taken to the AU summit in February to be adopted and ratified by member states, right?
Yes.
That document, I'm so excited by it because it really now sets very clear expectations for each African nation state, the AU member states, to address violence against women and girls in broad terms, but also now this opportunity that we have for media as well. And so within there, we talk about collaboration with regulators as well, right? So hopefully such a continental mechanism that builds on things like the Maputo Protocol, it builds up on the ILO Convention 190, really begins to set the pace that means that media organizations will now have to begin to work on their gender policies and make sure that the environments are enabling for African women in media for women, whether in Nigeria, in Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, etc., that the women that work in the environment are adequately provided for.
All right, Dr. Yemisi Akimbobola, I sincerely do appreciate you having to highlight and shed light on a very important and sensitive issue. And I do pray that your agenda, your journey actually yields the desired fruit. All right, let that particular goal be accomplished. So once again, thank you so much for coming on Voice of the People 90.3 FM to actually highlight and give us a proper orientation of this concept.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
You too, ma'am. Dr. Yemisi Akimbobola is a renowned British Nigerian media expert. She's a researcher and entrepreneur, of course, co-founder and CEO of African Women in Media. She promotes African women's voices and perspectives in global media. You can see how smooth she talks, how enlightened she is, how deep she is. And that is the kind of woman that we actually need to represent us, to actually let our voices be heard in this industry. All right, to have yourselves an amazing, wonderful evening. Of course, the political spotlight will be coming up very shortly. Just stay with us.